They make games about it, they make the best movies of it, but in reality, how many wars did America actually won? Let's find out here on Exploration X, but, before we continue, subscribe, to get all the latest videos from this channel. The Gulf War was a 1990–1991 armed campaign waged by a 35-country military coalition in response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Spearheaded by the United States, the coalition's efforts against Iraq were carried out in two key phases: Operation Desert Shield, which marked the military buildup from August 1990 to January 1991, and Operation Desert Storm, which began with the aerial bombing campaign against Iraq on 17 January 1991 and came to a close with the American-led liberation of Kuwait on 28 February 1991. On 2 August 1990, Iraq invaded the neighboring state of Kuwait and had fully occupied the country within 2 days. Initially, Iraq ran the occupied territory under a puppet government known as the Republic of Kuwait, before proceeding with an outright annexation in which Kuwaiti sovereign territory was split, with the Saadiyat al-Mitla district being carved out of the country's northern portion and the Kuwait Governorate covering the rest. Varying speculations have been made regarding the true intents behind the Iraqi invasion, most notably including Iraq's inability to repay the debt of more than $14 billion that it had borrowed from Kuwait to finance its military efforts during the Iran–Iraq War. Kuwait's demands for repayment were coupled with its surge in petroleum production levels, which kept revenues down for Iraq and further weakened its economic prospects. 28. Throughout much of the 1980s, Kuwait's oil production was above its mandatory quota under OPEC, which kept international oil prices down. Iraq interpreted the Kuwaiti refusal to decrease oil production as an act of aggression towards the Iraqi economy, leading up to the hostilities. The invasion of Kuwait was immediately met with international condemnation, including by the United Nations Security Council, which unanimously imposed economic sanctions against Iraq. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and American President George H.W. Bush deployed troops and equipment into Saudi Arabia and openly urged other countries to send their own forces to the scene. In response to the joint call, an array of countries joined the American-led coalition, forming the largest military alliance since World War II. The bulk of the coalition's military power was from the United States, with Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and Egypt as the largest lead-up contributors, in that order. Saudi Arabia and the Kuwaiti government in exile paid around $32 billion of the $60 billion cost to mobilize the coalition against Iraq. Initial efforts to dislodge the Iraqi presence in Kuwait began with an aerial and naval bombardment on 17 January 1991, which continued for 5 weeks. During this time, as the Iraqi military found itself unable to ward off the coalition's attacks, Iraq began to fire missiles at Israel. While the coalition itself did not consist of Israel, the Iraqi leadership had launched the campaign under the expectation that the missile barrage would provoke an independent Israeli military response, and hoped that such a response would prompt the coalition's Muslim-majority countries to. However, the jeopardization attempt was ultimately unsuccessful as Israel did not respond to any Iraqi attacks, and Iraq continued to remain at odds with most Muslim-majority countries. Iraqi missile barrages aimed at coalition targets stationed in Saudi Arabia were also largely unsuccessful, and on 24 February 1991, the coalition launched a major ground assault into Iraqi-occupied Kuwait. The offensive was a decisive victory for American-led coalition forces, who liberated Kuwait and promptly began to advance past the Iraq-Kuwait border into Iraqi territory. 100 hours after the beginning of the ground campaign, the coalition ceased its advance into Iraq and declared a ceasefire. Aerial and ground combat was confined to Iraq, Kuwait, and areas straddling the Iraq-Saudi Arabia border. The conflict marked the introduction of live news broadcasts from the front lines of the battle, principally by the American network CNN. It has also earned the nickname Video Game War, after the daily broadcast of images from cameras onboard American bombers during Operation Desert Storm. The Gulf War has gained notoriety for including 3 of the largest tank battles in American military history. Many returning coalition soldiers reported illnesses following their action in the war, a phenomenon known as Gulf War Syndrome (GWS) or Gulf War Illness (GWI). Common symptoms reported are chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and gastrointestinal disorder. There has been widespread speculation and disagreement about the causes of the illness and the possibly related birth defects. Researchers found that infants born to male veterans of the 1991 war had higher rates of 2 types of heart valve defects. Some children born after the war to Gulf War veterans had a certain kidney defect that was not found in Gulf War veterans' children born before the war. Researchers have said that they did not have enough information to link birth defects with exposure to toxic substances. In 1994, the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs with respect to Export Administration published a report entitled, U.S. Chemical and Biological Warfare-Related Dual-Use Exports to Iraq and Their Possible Impact on the Health Consequences of the Gulf War. This publication, called the Regal Report, summarized testimony this committee had received establishing that the U.S. had in the 1980s supplied Saddam Hussein with chemical and biological warfare technology, that Saddam had used such chemical weapons against Iran and his own native Kurds, and possibly against U.S. soldiers as well, plausibly contributing to the GWS. A 2022 study by Dr. Robert W. Haley of the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, et al. Of 1,016 U.S. Gulf War veterans found evidence of a causal link between GWS and exposure to low levels of the nerve agent sarin, which was released into the air by coalition bombing of Iraqi chemical weapons facilities. Significantly, the study found an increased incidence of GWS not only among veterans who recounted hearing nerve agent alarms, but also among veterans with the RR or QR, as opposed to the QQ forms of the PON1 gene, which produces an enzyme that deactivates organophosphates, including sarin, through hydrolysis. By contrast, GWS was inversely associated with higher levels of the type Q isozyme, which is more efficient at breaking down sarin than its type R counterpart. The authors found that the PON1 genotype and hearing nerve agent alarms were independent and the findings robust to both measured and unmeasured confounding, supporting a mechanistic gene-environment interaction. Moreover, the change in the combined effect from one category to the next was significantly greater than the sum of the independent effects of the environmental exposure and the genotype. Industrial age. The exact number of Iraqi combat casualties is unknown, but is believed to have been heavy. Some estimate that Iraq sustained between 20,000 and 35,000 fatalities. A report commissioned by the U.S. Air Force estimated 10,000–12,000 Iraqi combat deaths in the air campaign, and as many as 10,000 casualties in the ground war. This analysis is based on Iraqi prisoner of war reports. According to the Project on Defense Alternatives study, between 20,000 and 26,000 Iraqi military personnel were killed in the conflict while 75,000 others were wounded. According to Kanan Makia, for the Iraqi people, the cost of enforcing the will of the United Nations has been grotesque. General Schwarzkopf talked about a very large number of dead in these units, a very large number indeed. The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin, estimated that at least 65,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed. A figure was supported by Israeli sources who speak of 100,000 to 200,000 Iraqi casualties. Most of the killing took place during the ground war. Fleeing soldiers were bombed with a device known as a fuel-air explosive. Many lives were lost during the war, but like they say, there are no winners in war. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this small adventure, please like, subscribe and hit that bell for any updates. Feel free to comment down below what you would like to see next on Exploration X.